in the Bavarian Alps, where mountain streams run cold and clear through ancient valleys, a salt master named Heinrich tends the precious brine springs that have fed his town for generations. The year is 1347, and autumn has painted the beech forests in shades of amber and rust. Welcome to this quiet hour of the night. I am honored to share this time with you. As darkness settles around us, we will journey together to a medieval salt works in Bavaria, following Heinrich through the timeless rhythms of salt making and preservation. Allow yourself to sink deeper into comfort, knowing that this story asks nothing of you but to simply listen and rest. Heinrich was 41 years old, his hands permanently roughened from years of handling salt and timber, his graying auburn hair tucked beneath a wool cap worn smooth with age. He moved through his work with the same unhurried patience he brought to everything, noticing details others might miss, and finding mild amusement in the small peculiarities of daily life at the salt works. The morning began as mornings always did, with Heinrich walking from his cottage to the spring house while mist still clung to the valley floor. Dew had settled overnight on every surface, turning the world silver in the early light. His footsteps on the wooden walkway made barely a sound, the planks worn smooth by countless journeys just like this one. Inside the spring house, the air carried that distinctive mineral scent that had become as familiar to him as breathing. The brine pools lay still and dark, reflecting the glow from the oil lamps he lit one by one along the walls. Each flame added its warmth to the room, pushing back the morning chill that crept through the gaps in the timber walls. He checked the first pool with practiced ease, noting how the water level had dropped slightly overnight as the brine continued its slow concentration. The salt works operated on nature's own schedule, requiring only patience and attention rather than force or hurry. Heinrich had learned this truth early in his apprenticeship, watching his master tend these same pools with the same steady care. The wooden channels that fed fresh brine from the mountain spring needed their daily inspection. Heinrich made his way along each one, running his hand along the smooth wood, feeling for any roughness that might indicate wear or damage. The channels had been carved from pine logs decades before he was born, hollowed and fitted together with such precision that barely a drop escaped their joined seams. By the time he completed his morning rounds, pale sunlight had found its way through the high windows, casting long rectangles of light across the dark pools. Heinrich paused to watch dust motes drift through one of these beams, turning slowly in air currents too subtle to feel. The sight brought him that familiar sense of deep contentment, the recognition that this work, this place, was exactly where he belonged. His young assistant Martin arrived as the church bells rang for terce, carrying 2 wooden buckets and wearing an expression of cheerful determination. The boy was 17 years old, all earnest energy and eagerness to learn, and Heinrich had taken him on 6 months earlier when Martin's father, the town cooper, suggested the lad might benefit from learning a different trade. "Good morning, Master Heinrich," Martin said, setting down his buckets near the evaporation house. "I brought fresh water for drinking, and my mother sent bread." Heinrich nodded his appreciation, gesturing toward the small table where they took their meals when the weather kept them indoors. "Set them there. We'll break our fast once we've started the morning fires." The evaporation house stood separate from the spring house, connected by a covered walkway that kept workers dry during the frequent mountain rains. Inside, 3 large shallow pans waited to receive their daily measure of concentrated brine. These pans, beaten from iron by the town blacksmith and his father before him, had developed a dark patina over years of service, their surfaces smooth and even from constant use. Martin began laying the fire beneath the first pan while Heinrich measured out the brine. The boy had learned to build fires that burned steady rather than hot, producing the even heat necessary for proper evaporation. Too much flame would cause the brine to boil rather than simmer, creating salt crystals that were coarse and irregular rather than fine and pure. The morning routine unfolded with the comfortable rhythm of long practice. Heinrich poured the measured brine into the first pan, watching it spread across the dark iron surface. Martin added wood to the fire in careful amounts, adjusting the draft to maintain the temperature Heinrich had taught him to recognize by the quality of steam rising from the brine. "Tell me what you observe," Heinrich said, a question he asked most mornings to help the boy develop his attention to detail. Martin crouched beside the pan, studying the surface with genuine concentration. "The steam rises in an even pattern, Master Heinrich. No bubbling at the edges yet. The scent is changing as the water warms sharper now than when cold." "Good," Heinrich replied, allowing a slight smile to show his approval. "And what does this tell you about the fire?" "That it's burning as it should," Martin answered after a moment's thought. "Steady and reliable, not too eager." Heinrich hummed one of the plain chant melodies he had learned as a boy in the monastery school, a habit that emerged whenever he felt particularly satisfied with how a task was progressing. The melody drifted through the evaporation house, mingling with the gentle sounds of crackling wood and simmering brine. They worked side by side through the morning, tending the 3 pans in succession. Each required slightly different attention depending on how far along the evaporation had progressed. The first pan, just begun, needed only the steady heat and occasional checking. The second pan, started the previous afternoon, showed the first signs of salt formation, tiny crystals beginning to accumulate along the edges where the brine was most concentrated. The third pan, nearly complete, displayed a white crust of finished salt ready for harvesting. Heinrich demonstrated the harvesting process for Martin, using a broad wooden paddle to gather the salt crystals from the pan's surface. The tool had been shaped by his own hands years ago, carved from beech wood and worn to a silken smoothness by countless repetitions of this exact motion. He worked the paddle beneath the salt crust with careful pressure, lifting and turning, allowing excess brine to drain back into the pan. The harvested salt went into wide, shallow baskets woven from willow withes, each basket lined with clean linen to catch the finest grains. These baskets would sit near the fire for the remainder of the day, allowing any remaining moisture to evaporate completely before the salt was packed into barrels for storage or trade. "The salt tells you everything you need to know," Heinrich said as Martin practiced with his own paddle in the second pan. "If it comes away cleanly, the evaporation is complete. If it clings or crumbles, It needs more time, or perhaps the heat was uneven. Martin nodded, his tongue caught between his teeth in concentration as he maneuvered his paddle beneath a section of forming crust. When he lifted it successfully, his face brightened with pleasure at the accomplishment. By midday, when the bells rang for sext, both men were ready for the break. They sat on the bench outside the evaporation house, where a small overhang provided shade and a view down the valley toward the town. Martin unwrapped the bread his mother had sent, revealing a dense rye loaf studded with caraway seeds, along with a wedge of hard cheese aged in the salt master's own brine. They ate in companionable silence, watching clouds drift across the peaks that rose to the south. The mountains at this time of year wore their forests like mantles of colored wool, the beech trees golden, the oaks still holding patches of bronze and rust. Higher up, where trees gave way to rocky slopes, the first snow of the season had already appeared, a white dusting that would grow deeper as winter approached. "My father asks if you'll need more barrels soon," Martin said, breaking the peaceful quiet. "He's finishing a batch of oak casks and wondered if they might suit." Heinrich considered this while chewing a bite of bread. The salt works always needed barrels, both for storing the finished salt and for preparing meat and fish for preservation. Oak was ideal for the purpose, tight-grained and sturdy, imparting no unwanted flavors to whatever it held. "Tell him I'll visit his workshop tomorrow afternoon," Heinrich replied. "We should discuss what sizes would serve best. The merchants who come for autumn provisioning prefer smaller barrels they can manage more easily on their wagons." After their meal, the afternoon's work began with a different character than the morning's routine. While Martin continued tending the evaporation pans, Heinrich turned his attention to the preservation shed, where several townspeople would bring meat and fish for salting before winter's arrival. The preservation shed stood at the edge of the salt works compound, its walls lined with shelves and its center dominated by a massive cutting table worn concave by generations of use. Large earthenware crocks waited in rows, each one glazed on the inside to resist the corrosive action of brine. Smaller wooden boxes, made specially for the purpose, sat ready for dry salting methods. Anna, the butcher's wife, arrived first, leading a hand cart loaded with cuts of pork from the autumn slaughter. She was 53 years old, her capable hands weathered from years of work, her voice carrying the pleasant rasp that came from calling across market stalls. Heinrich had known her since childhood, when they had both attended the town's small school run by the parish priest. "Good afternoon, Heinrich," she greeted him with genuine warmth. "I've brought the pork we discussed. My husband says these are the finest cuts we've had in 3 years." Heinrich examined the meat with a practiced assessment. The pork had been properly prepared, cut into manageable pieces, trimmed of excess fat, and kept cool since slaughter. Each piece would need individual attention, but the quality was indeed excellent. "Your husband is correct," Heinrich said. "These will be salted beautifully. Let's begin with the dry cure for the smaller pieces, then we'll prepare brine for the larger cuts." They worked together at the cutting table, Heinrich measuring salt from one of his finished batches, while Anna arranged the meat in the wooden boxes he provided. The process required precision rather than haste. Too little salt, and the meat would spoil. Too much, and it would become unpalatably harsh. For the dry cure, Heinrich used salt mixed with a small measure of crushed juniper berries and dried herbs from his own garden. The juniper added a subtle flavor that complemented pork particularly well, while the herbs thyme and sage primarily contributed both taste and additional preservation properties. He had learned these combinations from the master who trained him, who had in turn learned them from his own teacher, a chain of knowledge stretching back through the years like a rope of plaited hemp. You'll want to turn these pieces every 3 days, Heinrich instructed as they layered salt and meat in alternating strata. Keep them in a cool place, away from direct sunlight. After 12 days, the cure will be complete and you can brush away the excess salt. Anna listened with close attention, though she had heard these instructions many times before. Good preservation was too important to risk through carelessness or faulty memory. The meat they prepared today would feed her family through the winter months when fresh provisions were scarce and expensive. For the larger cuts, they prepared a brine solution in one of the earthenware crocks. Heinrich measured water from the spring, checking its clarity and coldness before adding salt in careful proportions. The brine needed to be strong enough to preserve the meat, but not so concentrated that it would draw out all moisture and leave the flesh dry and tough. How do you know when the brine is right? Anna asked a question she posed each year, partly from genuine interest and partly from the pleasure of hearing Heinrich explain his craft. He produced a fresh egg from a basket by the door, lowering it carefully into the prepared brine. The egg sank partway, then floated with just its rounded top breaking the surface. When an egg floats thus, Heinrich said, the brine has reached proper strength. Too weak and the egg sinks. Too strong and it sits higher in the water. This method, passed down through generations of salt masters, had proven reliable across countless seasons. The egg test required no special tools or complex calculations, only attention and the wisdom to trust what had been learned and preserved through careful teaching. They submerged the larger pieces of pork in the prepared brine, weighing them down with a clean wooden board to keep them beneath the surface. The crock would sit in the coolest corner of the preservation shed, its contents transforming over the coming weeks as the salt worked its ancient magic, drawing out moisture, preventing decay, ensuring sustenance for the months ahead. When Anna departed with her cart now loaded with boxes and instructions, Heinrich returned to the evaporation house to check on Martin's progress. The afternoon light had taken on that particular golden quality that comes in autumn, slanting through the windows at a lower angle, warming everything it touched with honey-colored radiance. Martin had kept the fires steady, and the pans showed satisfying progress. The first pan displayed the early stages of crystal formation. The second had developed a substantial crust ready for evening harvest, and the third, which Heinrich had harvested that morning, had been thoroughly cleaned and now awaited its next filling of brine. "Well done," Heinrich said, and meant it sincerely. The boy had developed good instincts for the work, learning to read the subtle signs that indicated when to add wood, when to adjust the draft, when to simply wait and trust the process. They harvested the ready salt together as the afternoon eased toward evening, working in the comfortable silence that had become natural between them. The wooden paddles moved in rhythm, lift and turn, drain and transfer, each motion economical and sure. The salt accumulated in its baskets, white and crystalline, catching the slanting light and throwing back tiny reflections like captured stars. When the church bells rang for vespers, Heinrich sent Martin home to his supper, remaining behind himself to complete the day's final tasks. These evening hours, when he worked alone in the gathering dimness, had always brought him a particular sense of peace. The saltworks became even quieter as daylight faded, the sounds of the town receding into the distance, leaving only the whisper of the fires and the occasional settling of timbers in the cooling air. He banked the fires carefully, ensuring they would burn low through the night without requiring attention until morning. The brine in the pans would continue its slow concentration, requiring nothing but time and the gentle, steady heat. This was the nature of salt-making patient, reliable, asking only for consistent care rather than dramatic effort. Before leaving, Heinrich walked through both buildings one final time, checking that lamps were extinguished, that all was secure and orderly. His footsteps echoed softly on the wooden floors, a sound as familiar as his own breathing. The scent of salt and wood smoke hung in the air, mingling with the sharper mineral tang of the brine springs. Outside, dusk had settled over the valley, painting the sky in layers of deepening blue. The first stars had appeared above the eastern peaks, clear and bright in the mountain air. Heinrich paused on the walkway, allowing himself a moment to simply stand and observe, to feel the day's work settling into his bones as contentment rather than weariness. The walk back to his cottage took him past the town's small square, where a few people still moved about their evening routines. The baker's apprentice was closing shutters. The smith's fire still glowed in his forge, though the hammering had ceased. A dog trotted past on some canine errand, its tail waving in friendly greeting. Heinrich's cottage sat at the edge of the saltworks compound, a timber structure with whitewashed walls and a roof of wooden shingles that had weathered to the color of smoke. He had lived here for 19 years, since completing his apprenticeship and being granted the position of salt master by the town council. The cottage had become as much a part of him as his work-roughened hands or his habit of humming plain chant melodies. Inside, the single room held everything necessary for comfortable living and nothing more. A bed frame strung with rope supported a mattress stuffed with straw and wool. A table and 2 chairs occupied the space near the hearth. Shelves lined one wall, holding his few possessions: several wooden bowls, a clay jug, a precious book of hours inherited from his time in the monastery school, and various small items accumulated over the years. He built up the fire on the hearth, adding split logs to the coals that the neighbor woman who looked after the cottage had kept alive during his working hours. The wood caught readily, flames climbing around the bark, releasing the sweet scent of burning beech. Light spread through the room, dancing across the whitewashed walls and making shadows that shifted and reformed with each flicker. His supper waited on the table, left by the same neighbor: a bowl of barley pottage thick with autumn vegetables, a heel of dark bread, and a small cup of ale. Heinrich ate without hurry, savoring each bite, watching the firelight through half-closed eyes. The pottage carried the taste of onions and cabbage, seasoned with a pinch of the salt he himself had made, along with herbs from gardens he passed every morning on his way to work. After eating, he sat by the fire with his book of hours, though he did not read from it tonight. Instead, he simply held it, feeling the smoothness of the leather binding, remembering the monastery where he had spent his youth. He had not taken final vows, choosing instead to return to the town of his birth when his father's health had declined and a new salt master was needed. But those years among the brothers had shaped him, teaching him patience, attention to detail, and the value of work performed with care and devotion. The fire burned lower as evening deepened into night. Heinrich prepared for sleep with the same methodical attention he brought to all his tasks, banking the coals so they would last until morning, setting out his clothes for the next day, checking that the door was securely latched. These small rituals provided their own comfort, marking the boundary between the day's efforts and the night's rest. He lay down on his bed, pulling the wool blanket up to his shoulders. Through the small window near the ceiling, he could see a handful of stars, bright points against the darkness. The cottage creaked softly as it settled, timbers adjusting to the cooling air. From somewhere in the distance came the faint sound of the stream that fed the brine springs, a constant murmur that had been the backdrop of his entire life in this place. Sleep came easily, as it always did after a day of honest work. His last waking thought was of tomorrow's tasks, visiting the cooper's workshop, checking the preservation shed, harvesting more salt with Martin. The thoughts brought no anxiety, only a mild anticipation of continuing the work that gave his days their shape and meaning. Morning arrived with bird song and pale light filtering through the window. Heinrich rose without reluctance, splashing cold water on his face from the basin on his table, dressing in clothes still slightly warm from sitting near the banked fire. The air outside was crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke from the town's many hearths and the sharper mineral note that always drifted from the salt works. He made his way to the spring house through morning mist that clung to the valley floor like wool batting. The familiar walkway appeared and disappeared in the shifting whiteness, but his feet knew every plank and beam. Inside, he lit the lamps as he had done thousands of times before, each flame pushing back the darkness, revealing the dark pools of brine waiting with their infinite patience. The morning rounds proceeded with their customary rhythm. Heinrich checked water levels, inspected channels, tested temperatures with his hand, noting everything with the practiced assessment of long experience. The brine continued its slow concentration, obedient to laws older than the mountains themselves. Salt crystals grew in their pans, molecule by molecule, building structures of perfect geometry that would preserve meat through winter and season bread through all the seasons. Martin arrived as the mist began to lift, revealing the beech forests on the slopes above in their full autumn glory. The boy carried his buckets and wore an expression of pleasant eagerness that made Heinrich remember his own youth, when every day of apprenticeship had felt like a gift of knowledge waiting to be unwrapped. "Good morning, Master Heinrich," Martin said, setting his buckets in their accustomed places. "The morning is fine." "It is," Heinrich agreed. We'll harvest the second pan after we break our fast. Then I'll leave you to tend the fires while I visit your father's workshop." They shared bread and cheese at the bench outside, watching the last streamers of mist burn away under strengthening sunlight. The valley revealed itself gradually, the town with its cluster of buildings, the church spire rising above the other roofs, the fields beyond showing the brown stubble of harvested grain. Above it all, the mountains stood in their eternal arrangement, indifferent to human concerns, marking the passage of seasons by the rising and falling of snow on their highest peaks. After eating, they harvested the salt that had formed overnight, working in their established harmony. Martin had grown skilled with the paddle, no longer needing constant guidance, and Heinrich felt satisfaction in watching the boy's competence develop. Teaching someone a craft meant ensuring it would continue after you were gone, meant being part of that long rope of knowledge that stretched backward and forward through time. With the morning's primary tasks complete and Martin settled into his routine of tending the fires, Heinrich set out for the cooper's workshop. The walk took him through the center of town, past the market square, where vendors were setting up their stalls for the day's trading. The smell of fresh bread drifted from the baker's shop. The blacksmith's hammer had already begun its rhythmic ringing. A woman called a greeting from her doorway, and Heinrich raised his hand in acknowledgement. The cooper's workshop occupied a large building near the town's edge, where cart traffic could reach it easily. The sharp, clean scent of fresh-cut oak filled the air around it, mingling with the mellower smell of wood shavings and the hint of smoke from the forge where barrel hoops were shaped and fitted. Heinrich could hear the steady tapping of the cooper's hammer before he rounded the corner and saw the workshop's open doors. Thomas the cooper was 61 years old, his strong hands marked by decades of working with wood and metal, his movements still precise despite the slight stiffness that had crept into his joints over recent years. He looked up from the barrel he was assembling as Heinrich entered, his weathered face creasing into a smile of welcome. "Heinrich," he said, setting down his hammer, "Martin said you might visit today. Come see what I have ready." The workshop's interior was organized with the careful logic of a craftsman who had spent a lifetime perfecting his methods. Completed barrels stood in neat rows along one wall, sorted by size. Barrel staves leaned in careful stacks, sorted by type of wood and degree of seasoning. Tools hung on pegs, each in its designated place, handles worn smooth by years of handling. Thomas led Heinrich to a section where perhaps 24 barrels waited in various sizes. The smallest would hold about 5 gallons, suitable for household use or small-scale trading. The medium sizes ranged from 10 to 20 gallons, the most commonly requested for merchants' wagons. A few large barrels stood at the back, capable of holding 40 gallons or more, used primarily for storage at the salt works itself. Heinrich examined each size with careful attention, running his hands over the oak staves, checking the tightness of the hoops, the evenness of the rims. Thomas's work was consistently excellent. The staves fitted together with barely a hairline gap. The hoops were positioned exactly where they should be to provide maximum strength, and the wood itself was well-seasoned oak that would last for years of regular use. "Your work is as fine as ever," Heinrich said, and saw the quiet pleasure this brought to the older man's face. Craftsmen might not seek elaborate praise, but they valued the recognition of quality from those who understood their trade. They discussed quantities and timing, settling on an order that would serve the salt works through the coming winter and into spring. Thomas quoted his prices, which were fair and had remained steady for years, and Heinrich agreed without negotiation. They had been doing business together for nearly 2 decades, and trust had long since replaced the need for careful bargaining. "Martin is learning well," Thomas said as they concluded their business. "You have patience with him, and he speaks of you with respect." "He's a good lad," Heinrich replied. "Attentive and careful. Those qualities matter more than quick cleverness in our work." They stood together in the workshop's doorway, looking out at the town going about its midday activities. The market square was filled with people buying and selling, voices calling out prices and greetings, children darting between the stalls. It was a scene that had repeated itself every market day for as long as either man could remember, part of the reliable rhythm of town life. "Will you take some ale before you go?" Thomas offered. "My wife drew a fresh pitcher this morning." Heinrich accepted, following Thomas into the small room at the back of the workshop where the cooper and his family took their meals. Thomas's wife, Elizabeth, was there with their youngest daughter, both working at embroidery in the light from a south-facing window. They greeted Heinrich warmly, and Elizabeth poured ale into wooden cups while her daughter fetched a plate of oat cakes. They sat around the scarred wooden table, drinking and talking of small matters: the coming winter, the harvest's quality, news from travelers passing through town. The conversation required no effort, flowing naturally between people who had known each other for years and felt no need to impress or perform. Heinrich found himself relaxing into the comfortable exchange, his usual reserve softening in the presence of old friends. The ale was good, slightly sweet with a pleasant bite, and the oat cakes were fresh and filling. When Heinrich eventually rose to leave, the sun had moved well past its zenith, and he knew Martin would be ready for his company back at the salt works. He thanked Elizabeth for the refreshment and Thomas once more for the barrels, then made his way back through the town's afternoon bustle. The preservation shed had acquired 2 more visitors during his absence. Heinrich found them waiting when he returned. Old Johann, the fisherman, had brought several large trout wrapped in dock leaves, their silver scales still gleaming with freshness. Beside him stood Marguerite, the widow who kept chickens and geese, carrying a basket containing 4 dressed chickens she wished to preserve. "Good afternoon," Heinrich greeted them both. "Johann, those are handsome fish. Marguerite, your chickens look well fattened." They exchanged pleasantries while Heinrich assessed what each had brought. The trout were indeed fine specimens, caught that morning from the cold streams that fed down from the mountains. The chickens were plump and cleanly prepared, their pale flesh firm and fresh. Both would preserve well with proper treatment. He worked with Johann first, showing him the method for dry salting fish that would keep them through the winter without becoming too dry or harsh. The process required rubbing salt thoroughly into the flesh, paying particular attention to the cavity and the thick muscles near the spine. Heinrich demonstrated with the first trout, his work-roughened hands moving with practiced efficiency. "Leave them in the salt for 5 days," he instructed. Then rinse them briefly and hang them in a cool, dry place. They'll finish drying over the next 2 weeks and will keep for months after that. Johann watched closely, nodding at each step. He had been fishing these streams for more than 40 years, but fish preservation was specialized knowledge, and he trusted Heinrich's expertise absolutely. When Heinrich finished demonstrating, Johann set to work on his remaining fish, replicating each motion he had observed. While Johann worked, Heinrich turned his attention to Marguerite's chickens. For poultry, he preferred a brine method that kept the meat more tender than dry salt would allow. He prepared a fresh brine in one of the medium earthenware crocks, using the egg test to verify proper concentration, then added bay leaves and crushed peppercorns to enhance the flavor. These will need to stay submerged for 8 days, he told Marguerite as they lowered the chickens into the brine. After that, you can either smoke them or simply store them in a cool place. The brine will have done its work. Marguerite listened with the focused attention of someone for whom every bit of stored food meant security through the lean months. She was 47 years old, her work-worn hands, speaking of years, spent tending her birds and her small garden, her voice soft but confident. Heinrich had helped her preserve food every autumn since her husband had died 7 years earlier, and he always took special care to ensure she understood each process completely. When both Johann and Marguerite had departed, carrying their preserved provisions and Heinrich's careful instructions, he stood alone in the preservation shed for a moment, breathing in the mingled scents of salt and herbs and wood. The afternoon light slanted through the high windows, illuminating dust motes that drifted in their slow, eternal dance. The earthenware crocks sat in their rows, holding their transforming contents, patient vessels of an ancient alchemy. He returned to the evaporation house to find Martin banking the fires for the evening. The pans showed good progress, one ready for immediate harvest, one halfway through its concentration, one freshly filled and just beginning its long transformation. The cycle continued, endless and reliable, salt from brine, from spring, from mountain, from rain, from sea, around and around through time immemorial. They harvested together in the slanting evening light, their paddles moving in synchronized rhythm. The finished salt accumulated in its baskets, white and pure, each crystal a tiny miracle of geometry and chemistry. Heinrich felt the familiar satisfaction of work well done, of useful labor performed with care and skill. "You're becoming quite proficient," he told Martin as they finished. "Another season or two, and you'll need little guidance from me." The boy's face brightened with pleasure at the praise, and Heinrich remembered again what it felt like to be young and learning, to receive acknowledgement from someone whose opinion mattered. He resolved to speak such encouragement more often, remembering how much it had meant to him when his own master had done the same. As Martin departed for his evening meal, Heinrich completed his customary rounds, checking that all was secure and properly maintained. The salt works had become an extension of himself over the years, its rhythms matching his own, its needs as familiar as his own body's requirements. He moved through the familiar spaces with a sense of belonging so deep it required no conscious thought. The walk home took him past the church, where evening light caught the stained glass windows and scattered colored radiance across the stone steps. He paused briefly, as he often did, simply observing the play of light, the way the colors shifted as he moved, the ancient glass transforming ordinary sunlight into something approaching the sacred. At his cottage, he built up the fire and ate the simple supper that awaited him: more pottage, this time with chunks of turnip and carrot, along with a bit of smoked bacon that added richness to the vegetables. He ate slowly, savoring each spoonful, letting the day's events settle in his mind like sediment drifting to the bottom of a still pool. After supper, he sat by the fire with his book of hours, this time actually reading, following the familiar Latin prayers by the flickering firelight. The words brought comfort through their repetition, their connection to something larger than his individual life, their reminder that he was part of a vast community of believers stretching across both space and time. When full darkness had fallen and the fire had burned to coals, Heinrich prepared for sleep with his usual methodical care. The cottage creaked its familiar evening song. Outside, an owl called from the beech forest, its voice carrying clearly through the mountain air. Heinrich lay in his bed, warm beneath his wool blanket, feeling the pleasant weariness of muscles well used settling into his bones. Tomorrow would bring more of the same: the morning rounds, the evaporation pans, the preservation work, the small conversations and quiet satisfactions that composed his days. The thought brought no restlessness, only a deep contentment. This was his life, his work, his place in the world's great pattern. It was enough. It had always been enough. Sleep drifted over him like the mist that filled the valley each morning, gentle and natural, carrying him down into darkness and rest. The next morning brought a change in the weather. Clouds had moved in overnight, settling low over the valley and bringing with them a fine, misting rain that softened all sounds and blurred the edges of distant objects. Heinrich walked to the salt works through this gentle precipitation, his wool cloak darkening with moisture, droplets collecting on the fabric and rolling slowly downward. Inside the spring house, the air felt closer than usual, the moisture from outside mingling with the mineral-scented atmosphere. He lit the lamps with extra care, ensuring each wick was trimmed properly, each flame steady and bright against the gray morning. The brine pools reflected the lamplight in rippling patterns, creating moving shadows on the timber walls. The morning rounds took on a different character in the rain. Water dripped from the eaves with a steady patter, and the wooden walkways between buildings gleamed with wetness. Heinrich moved with his usual unhurried pace, checking each channel and pool, noting how the increased humidity affected the evaporation rates. On days like this, the pans would work more slowly, requiring patience and perhaps slightly higher fires to compensate. Martin arrived with his hood pulled low against the rain, water streaming from the oiled wool. "Good morning, Master Heinrich," he called as he ducked through the evaporation house door, shaking droplets from his cloak. "My mother says this rain will last through tomorrow at least." "Then we'll adjust our work accordingly," Heinrich replied. He had learned long ago not to fight against weather but rather to work with it, accepting what each day brought and modifying his methods to suit conditions. "We'll build the fires a bit higher today and perhaps harvest less, allowing extra time for the final drying. They broke their fast together at the indoor table, listening to the rain drum on the roof above. The sound created a peaceful enclosure, making the evaporation house feel even more sheltered and secure. Martin's mother had sent honey cakes along with the usual bread, a small luxury that brought sweetness to the damp morning. After eating, they tended the fires together, adding wood more generously than usual to counteract the moisture-heavy air. The flames climbed higher in their fireboxes, casting stronger light through the room, their warmth pushing back the clamminess that had crept in with the rain. Heinrich showed Martin how to read the steam rising from the pans, how to distinguish between the healthy vapor of proper evaporation and the heavier, wetter steam that indicated the fires needed adjustment. "Everything speaks to you if you learn its language," Heinrich said, a phrase his own master had repeated countless times during his apprenticeship. The salt, the fire, the weather, they all communicate what they need, what they're doing. Our task is to listen and respond. Martin nodded, his young face serious with concentration. The boy had that quality Heinrich valued most in an apprentice, the ability to be still and attentive, to observe without rushing to action, to trust that understanding would come through patient watching rather than hasty experimentation. By mid-morning, they had established a steady rhythm appropriate to the day's conditions. The pans simmered contentedly, producing salt at a slower rate but with no less quality. Heinrich used the extra time to show Martin the finer points of crystal assessment, how to determine by sight and touch whether salt had reached its optimal state for harvesting. "See here," he said, lifting a small sample from the pan's edge. "The crystals have grown to the right size, large enough to have good texture, but not so large they become coarse. The color is pure white with no gray or yellow tinting. And when you press it between your fingers, it crumbles cleanly rather than clumping or turning pasty." Martin tried it himself, taking samples from different areas of the pan, comparing textures and appearances. His movements were careful and deliberate, showing the influence of Heinrich's teaching. The boy was learning not just the mechanics of salt making, but the deeper skill of attention, of bringing focused awareness to each task regardless of how simple it might seem. The rain continued through the middle hours of the day, sometimes strengthening to a proper downpour, sometimes subsiding to little more than a damp breath of moisture. The salt works became an island of warmth and light in the gray afternoon, the fires burning steadily, the lamps glowing, the familiar sense of salt and wood smoke creating an atmosphere of sheltered comfort. Heinrich found himself thinking about the passage of seasons, how autumn rain like this announced the transition toward winter, how the work of the salt works shifted subtly with each changing month. In spring, there would be the cleaning and repair after winter's rest. Summer brought the busiest production, taking advantage of warm, dry weather for rapid evaporation. Autumn was harvest time, preserving the results of summer's abundance. And winter meant slower, more contemplative work, maintaining production at a reduced pace while the world outside rested beneath snow. A knock at the door interrupted his musings. Peter, the town baker, stood outside with a large basket covered by a cloth. He was 29 years old, His forearms developed with the particular musculature that came from years of kneading dough. His face dusted with flour that even the rain hadn't entirely washed away. "Heinrich," he said, stepping inside and setting down his basket with evident relief. "I've brought loaves for salting if you have time today." Heinrich had worked with Peter on this same task each autumn for the past 5 years, ever since the young man had taken over his father's bakery. Salted bread was a specialty of the region, made by incorporating salt directly into the dough in carefully calculated amounts, then coating the finished loaves with coarse salt crystals before a final brief baking. The result was bread that kept longer than ordinary loaves and had a distinctive, savory flavor that people valued. "I have time," Heinrich assured him. "Martin, continue watching the pans. Peter and I will work in the preservation shed." They crossed between buildings through the rain, moving quickly but without panic. In the preservation shed, Peter unwrapped his basket to reveal 24 unbaked loaves, their dough already risen and shaped, waiting for their salt treatment before the final baking. Heinrich brought out his finest salt, the batch he reserved for table use and special purposes. This salt had been harvested at the exact moment of optimal crystal formation, then dried slowly to perfect dryness without any harshness. He measured it carefully, both the amount to incorporate into each loaf and the coarser crystals for the exterior coating. "Watch how I work with the first one," Heinrich said, taking up one of the loaves. "The interior salt gets kneaded very gently. We don't want to deflate the dough. Just distribute the salt evenly throughout." His work-roughened hands moved with surprising delicacy, pressing the measured salt into the soft dough, folding and turning, incorporating without crushing. Years of this work had taught his muscles exactly how much pressure to apply, how many folds were sufficient, and how to recognize when the distribution was complete. Peter watched intently, then began working on his own loaves, replicating Heinrich's technique. The baker's hands were already skilled at handling dough, and he adapted quickly to the specific requirements of salt incorporation. They worked side by side at the cutting table, the rain providing a gentle percussion on the roof above, their movements falling into a comfortable shared rhythm. "My wife sends her thanks for the salt you provided last month," Peter said as they worked. "She says it's the finest she's had for preserving the autumn vegetables." "I'm pleased it serves well," Heinrich replied. He found satisfaction in these small acknowledgments, these confirmations that his work provided real value to people's lives. Salt seemed simple, almost invisible in its ubiquity, but its importance ran through every aspect of daily life, preserving food, flavoring bread, maintaining health, even serving as currency in some transactions. When the interior salting was complete, they moved to the exterior coating. Heinrich demonstrated the technique of brushing each loaf with water, then pressing it into a shallow pan of coarse salt crystals so they adhered to the dough's surface. The crystals caught the lamplight, turning each loaf into something that sparkled faintly, like bread studded with tiny diamonds. "These will bake beautifully," Heinrich said as they finished the last loaf. "The exterior salt will create a slight crust, and the interior salt will be distributed evenly through the crumb. They'll keep for weeks without going stale." Peter carefully loaded his treated loaves back into the basket, covering them with the cloth to protect them from rain during his walk back to the bakery. "I'll bring you 2 finished loaves tomorrow," he promised. "My thanks for your help, Heinrich." After Peter departed, Heinrich stood in the preservation shed doorway, watching rain fall on the compound. The droplets created expanding circles in the puddles that had formed on the walkways, each circle intersecting with others to create complex, constantly shifting patterns. He found himself mesmerized by the simple geometry of it, the way such basic elements, water, gravity, surface tension, could generate such endless variation. The afternoon progressed with its own quiet rhythm. Heinrich returned to the evaporation house to relieve Martin for his midday meal, tending the fires and checking the pans while the boy went home to eat. The rain had settled into a steady, moderate fall, neither heavy nor light, the kind of precipitation that could continue for days without changing character. Alone with the fires and the simmering brine, Heinrich hummed his plain chant melodies, the ancient tunes rising and falling in the warm air. The music seemed to belong to days like this, contemplative and measured, matching the pace of rain and evaporation and the slow crystallization of salt from solution. He felt that deep contentment returning, that sense of being exactly where he should be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. Martin returned after an hour, and they worked together through the remainder of the afternoon, harvesting salt from one pan, monitoring progress in the others, and maintaining the fires at their rain-adjusted levels. The boy had become quiet, falling into the meditative state that sometimes overtook him during repetitive work, and Heinrich recognized the mood because he experienced it himself so often, that sense of time expanding and contracting simultaneously, of being fully present while also somehow outside the normal flow of minutes and hours. As evening approached and the gray light began its transition toward darkness, Heinrich sent Martin home once more, remaining behind to complete the day's final tasks. The fires were banked, the pans set for their overnight work, the salt works made secure against the continuing rain. He moved through the familiar sequence with movements that required no conscious thought, his body knowing each action through years of repetition. Walking home through the rain-dimmed evening, Heinrich noticed how the wet cobblestones gleamed in the lamplight from windows, how the sound of rain on thatch created a softer quality than rain on tile, how the smell of wood smoke from hearth fires mixed with the petrichor of wet earth and stone. The town felt peaceful in the rain, settled and quiet, everyone snug in their homes, while the weather had its way with the world outside. At his cottage, he found that his neighbor had left not only his supper, but also had built up the fire to a cheerful blaze. The warmth and light welcomed him inside, and he felt grateful for this small kindness, this thoughtful attention to his comfort. He made a mental note to bring her some of his finest salt as thanks, perhaps tomorrow if the rain cleared enough for visiting. Supper was fish stew tonight, pieces of preserved trout in a rich broth with leeks and barley, the flavors melding together into something deeply satisfying. Heinrich ate slowly by the fire, feeling the day's dampness gradually leaving his bones, the warmth seeping in to replace it. The rain continued its steady drumming on the roof, but inside it was dry and comfortable and safe. After eating, He found he had no energy for reading, no desire for anything but to sit and watch the fire and listen to the rain. Sometimes rest meant activity, and sometimes it meant simply being still, allowing the mind to empty and settle like water finding its level. Tonight called for stillness, for the quiet pleasure of warmth and shelter while the weather moved through the world outside. He prepared for sleep earlier than usual, drawn by the particular coziness that rainy nights seemed to create. Under his wool blanket, listening to water patter on the roof above, Heinrich felt sleep approaching like a friend, familiar and welcome. His last conscious thought was of tomorrow, whether the rain would continue, how it would affect the day's work, what adjustments he might need to make. But these were not anxious thoughts, only gentle anticipations, and they dissolved as sleep carried him down into its peaceful depths. The rain continued through the night and into the next day, settling into the valley like a long-staying guest. Heinrich woke to its familiar sound and found he had grown accustomed to it already, accepting it as simply another element of autumn's progression. He rose and dressed and made his way to the salt works through the wet morning, his movements unhurried, his mind calm and clear. The rain persisted through the second day with the same steady patience it had shown since arriving. Heinrich worked through his morning rounds with practiced efficiency, noting how the brine pools seemed to steam slightly in the cool, damp air, their warmth meeting the moisture-laden atmosphere to create thin wisps of vapor that rose and dissipated. Martin arrived punctually despite the weather, his dedication to the work evident in his willingness to venture out in conditions that kept many townspeople indoors. They shared a quiet breakfast, the companionable silence between them needing no words to feel complete. The bread was fresh despite the rain, and the cheese had that sharp, clean taste that came from proper aging in salt brine. "My father finished 3 of the small barrels yesterday," Martin mentioned as they ate. "He said to tell you they're ready whenever you wish to collect them." "Good," Heinrich replied. "Perhaps tomorrow if this rain decides to move along. Barrels don't mind getting wet, but I prefer not to be soaked when carrying them." The comment brought a slight smile to Martin's face, and Heinrich felt pleased at managing to lighten the boy's mood. Young people sometimes took weather too seriously, forgetting that rain was simply rain, neither good nor bad in itself, merely requiring adaptation and patience. They spent the morning working on a task Heinrich had been postponing, sorting through the stored salt from summer's production. The barrels stood in neat rows in the storage room attached to the evaporation house, each marked with the date of its filling. Some salt was destined for local use, some for trade with merchants who traveled through the region, and some for the special preservation work that required the finest quality. Heinrich showed Martin how to assess each barrel's contents, checking for any signs of moisture penetration that might have caused clumping or degradation. They opened each container carefully, examining the salt's color and texture, its smell and the way it felt between the fingers. Most barrels proved perfectly maintained, but a few required attention. Salt that had absorbed minimal moisture needed to be spread in shallow pans near the fires to dry completely before resealing. "Salt is patient," Heinrich explained as they worked, "but it isn't passive. It responds to its environment, absorbing moisture from air, changing its character based on how it's stored and handled. Our job is to understand these responses and work with them. The task occupied most of the morning, requiring careful attention but not intense physical effort. Heinrich found it satisfying in a different way than the daily production work. It was maintenance rather than creation, preservation of what had already been made rather than the making itself. Both types of work were necessary. Both had their place in the cycle of the salt works. By midday, when they paused for their meal, the rain had lightened somewhat, though not ceased entirely. Through the high windows of the evaporation house, Heinrich could see patches of brighter sky appearing between the clouds, suggesting the weather might finally be moving toward change. The air felt marginally less oppressive, and there was a quality to the light that hinted at eventual clearing. "The rain may end tonight," he said, more to himself than to Martin, though the boy nodded in agreement. After their meal, Heinrich decided to visit the preservation shed to check on the various items that were undergoing their transformations. The pork Anna had brought was progressing well in its brine, the liquid still clear and properly concentrated. The chickens for Marguerite were also developing as they should, their flesh taking on the subtle changes that indicated successful preservation. Johann's trout, hanging from their hooks to dry, had reached that perfect stage where most moisture had departed, but the flesh retained enough suppleness to avoid becoming brittle. He made notes on a wooden tablet using a piece of charcoal, recording the progress of each batch, when each would be ready for collection, what adjustments, if any, were needed. These records helped him track his methods across seasons, allowing him to refine his techniques through observation of what worked best under varying conditions. A knock at the shed door announced another visitor. Heinrich opened it to find Wilhelm, the town's leather worker, standing with a bundle wrapped in oiled cloth. Wilhelm was 36 years old, his hands stained permanently brown from the tannins he worked with daily, his manner quiet and methodical in a way Heinrich recognized and appreciated. "Heinrich," Wilhelm greeted him, "I've brought some hides I'd like to salt before tanning. Do you have time to advise me?" "Of course," Heinrich said, stepping back to allow Wilhelm inside. "Let's see what you've brought." Wilhelm unwrapped his bundle to reveal 3 sheepskins, already cleaned and prepared for the next stage of processing. They were good quality hides, properly fleshed and showing no signs of damage or poor handling. For leather making, salt served multiple purposes. It preserved the hide before tanning, helped remove remaining moisture, and assisted in setting the fibers in preparation for the tanning agents. "These will want heavy salting," Heinrich said, examining the hides with careful attention. "More than you'd use for meat preservation. The goal is to draw out as much moisture as possible while preventing any decay during the preparation period." He measured out salt from his working supply, showing Wilhelm the proper quantity and technique. Unlike with food preservation, where salt needed to be distributed carefully to avoid over-harshness, leather preparation benefited from liberal application. They worked together to rub salt thoroughly into the flesh side of each hide, paying particular attention to the thicker areas where moisture might linger. "Leave them folded flesh to flesh for 3 days," Heinrich instructed. Then shake out the old salt and reapply fresh. After another 3 days, they'll be ready for your tanning process. Wilhelm listened with focused attention, occasionally asking questions that demonstrated both his knowledge of his own craft and his respect for Heinrich's expertise in salt. They discussed how the salt would affect the hide's texture, how it interacted with the tanning agents Wilhelm would apply later, and how weather conditions might influence the timing of each stage. When Wilhelm departed with his salted hides carefully rewrapped, Heinrich stood again in the doorway, watching the rain that had picked up slightly during their conversation. The afternoon was advancing, the light already taking on that earlier dimness that came with autumn's shortened days and overcast skies. He felt the pleasant tiredness that came from steady, useful work, from sharing knowledge with those who valued it. Returning to the evaporation house, he found Martin had harvested another pan of salt during his absence. The boy had worked carefully, producing a harvest of uniformly good quality, and Heinrich praised him sincerely. Such competence in one so young spoke well of Martin's future in the craft, assuming he chose to continue with it rather than returning to his father's cooperation. They worked together through the remainder of the afternoon, preparing pans for the next day's production, organizing supplies, performing the 100 small tasks that kept the salt works running smoothly. The rain created a steady background rhythm, and the warmth from the fires made the workspace feel increasingly cozy as daylight faded. When the church bells rang for vespers, Heinrich sent Martin home as usual, remaining behind himself to complete the evening tasks. Banking the fires had become such an ingrained habit that his hands moved through the sequence, while his mind wandered elsewhere thinking about the barrels he would collect tomorrow, about whether the rain would indeed clear, about what preservation work might arrive in the coming days as more townspeople completed their autumn preparations. The walk home took him past the church once more, and he noticed light glowing from within and heard the faint sound of voices raised in evening prayer. On impulse, he changed his route slightly, entering through the heavy wooden door into the church's dim interior. A handful of townspeople occupied the pews, their voices blending in the familiar Latin phrases of Vespers. Heinrich slipped into a seat near the back, adding his own voice softly to the prayers. He had not been inside the church for several weeks, his work consuming his days, but returning now felt proper and good. The stone walls held a coolness that contrasted pleasantly with the rain-dampened warmth outside. Candlelight flickered on the altar, and the scent of beeswax and old incense hung in the air. The prayers washed over him, words repeated so many times they had become almost physical presences, solid and comforting. He thought of the brothers at the monastery where he had spent his youth, who would be performing these same prayers at this same hour, linked across distance by the church's rhythms. The thought brought him a sense of connection, of being part of something vast and enduring. When the prayers concluded, he remained seated for a few extra moments, allowing the silence to settle. Other worshippers departed quietly, their footsteps whispering on stone, the door opening and closing with soft thuds. Finally, Heinrich rose, made his way to the door, and stepped back out into the rainy evening. His cottage welcomed him with familiar comfort, the fire his neighbor had built, the smell of the evening meal she had left, the simple security of his own space after a long day's work. He ate his supper slowly, a thick vegetable soup with chunks of dark bread for dipping, letting the warmth spread through him from the inside while the fire provided warmth from without. After eating, he sat with his book of hours, reading the prayers for the hour, letting the Latin words roll through his mind in their ancient cadences. Outside, the rain continued its patient falling, but inside all was warm and dry and peaceful. The day folded itself away, making room for night and rest. When Heinrich finally lay down to sleep, the sound of rain on the roof had become so familiar it was almost like silence, a constant that required no attention. He pulled his blanket close and felt his body relaxing into the mattress, muscles releasing the day's accumulated tension. His breathing slowed and deepened, and consciousness began its gentle retreat. Sleep came like the rain itself, steady, natural, inevitable, carrying him down into depths where no thoughts remained. Only the pure rest his body needed and welcomed. The third morning brought the change Heinrich had anticipated. He woke to silence, no rain drumming on the roof, no water dripping from the eaves. Rising and looking through his small window, he saw clouds breaking apart, allowing glimpses of pale blue sky. The ground was thoroughly soaked, puddles everywhere, but the air had that scrubbed clean quality that comes after prolonged rain. He made his way to the salt works through a world that seemed to be waking alongside him. Birds had emerged from wherever they sheltered during the rain, and their songs filled the morning air with exuberant complexity. Water dripped from every surface, creating a symphony of quiet percussion. The sun broke through the dissipating clouds in broad shafts of golden light that seemed almost solid enough to touch. Inside the spring house, Heinrich lit the lamps and began his rounds with a sense of renewal that the weather clearing seemed to have brought. The brine pools reflected not just lamplight now, but also the natural daylight streaming through windows, their surfaces rippling gently with air currents. Everything felt fresher, cleaner, ready for continued work. Martin arrived with an expression of relief at the improved weather. "My mother says we should have 3 clear days at least," he reported. "She can tell by the wind direction and the color of the evening sky yesterday." "Mothers often know these things," Heinrich agreed with a slight smile. "We'll take advantage of it, open all the windows and doors to air everything out, increase our production while the drying conditions are favorable." They worked through the morning with heightened efficiency, the clearer weather seeming to energize both of them. The evaporation pans responded to the lower humidity with increased output, and they harvested salt twice before midday, filling more baskets than they had in the previous 2 days combined. During their meal break, Heinrich proposed they visit Thomas the cooper that afternoon to collect the finished barrels. Martin agreed enthusiastically, clearly pleased at the prospect of a walk through town after being confined mostly to the salt works during the rain. After their meal, Heinrich and Martin set out for the cooper's workshop, enjoying the clear afternoon air and the sunshine that had grown warm enough to begin drying the soaked ground. Puddles still dotted the streets, reflecting fragments of blue sky, but the mud had already started firming up under the sun's attention. The walk took them past the market square, which had come alive again after the rain-enforced quiet. Vendors had returned to their stalls, displaying autumn produce, turnips and cabbages, late apples, bundles of dried herbs tied with twine. The butcher had set out fresh sausages, and the smell of them grilling over his small brazier drifted across the square, mingling with the scent of new bread from the baker's shop. Heinrich noticed Peter standing in his doorway and raised a hand in greeting. The baker disappeared momentarily, then emerged carrying 2 loaves wrapped in cloth. He crossed the square quickly, his face bright with satisfaction. "The salted bread," Peter said, presenting the loaves to Heinrich. "They came out perfectly, my best batch yet. My customers have already been asking when I'll make more." Heinrich accepted the loaves, feeling their weight, noting the faint sparkle of salt crystals still visible on their crusts. "I'm pleased they turned out well. You're welcome to bring more dough whenever you're ready." They exchanged a few more pleasantries before Peter returned to his shop, and Heinrich and Martin continued toward the cooper's workshop. Martin had been quiet during the exchange, watching the interaction with the attentive observation that characterized his approach to learning. Heinrich suspected the boy was absorbing not just the mechanics of various crafts, but also the relationships between craftspeople, the way respect and mutual assistance bound the community together. At the workshop, they found Thomas finishing the assembly of a large barrel, his hammer tapping hoops into place with rhythmic precision. He set aside his tools when he saw them approach, wiping his hands on a rag tucked into his belt. "Heinrich, Martin," he greeted them. "You've come for the small barrels, they're ready, come see." The 3 finished barrels stood near the workshop's rear door, each one about 2 feet tall and perfectly proportioned. Thomas had marked them with Heinrich's initial burn into the wood near the top, a small touch that spoke to his attention to detail. Heinrich examined each barrel carefully, finding the craftsmanship as excellent as he had expected. "These will serve admirably," Heinrich said. "What's your price for the 3? Thomas named a sum that was fair without being generous, the price of quality work from a master craftsman. Heinrich counted out coins from the leather pouch he wore at his belt, old silver pennies that clinked softly as they changed hands. Money was less common in most transactions. People more often traded goods or services directly, but between craftsmen of different trades. Coins simplified matters considerably. "Martin," Heinrich said, "help me carry these back. We'll manage 1 each, and the 3rd we can return for." The boy moved to lift one of the barrels, testing its weight. They were empty and therefore manageable for a single person, though awkward to carry far. Thomas offered them a length of rope to make handles, which Heinrich accepted gratefully. They set off back toward the salt works, each carrying a barrel suspended from rope handles. The walk went slowly, requiring them to pause occasionally to adjust their grips, but the clear weather made even this laborious task pleasant. Other townspeople they passed offered greetings or comments about the barrels, creating small conversations that Heinrich answered briefly but courteously. By the time they reached the salt works and deposited their burdens in the storage room, both men were breathing harder from the effort. They rested for a few moments before Heinrich decided they should retrieve the 3rd barrel immediately, rather than putting off the task until later. The return trip to Thomas's workshop and back again consumed most of the afternoon, but Heinrich felt satisfied with the accomplishment. Having the new barrels meant he could organize the stored salt more efficiently, set aside specific quantities for different purposes, and be better prepared for the merchants who would arrive soon seeking provisions for winter trading. With all 3 barrels safely stored, they turned their attention back to the evaporation pans. The clear, dry air had worked wonders. Salt was forming at nearly twice the usual rate. They harvested enthusiastically, filling basket after basket with white crystals that caught the afternoon sunlight and threw back tiny rainbows where the light struck them just right. "We should celebrate this productivity," Heinrich said as they finished filling the 8th basket. "Perhaps tomorrow we'll make a special batch salt mixed with dried rosemary and thyme for cooking. People always appreciate that for autumn feasts." Martin's face showed his pleasure at this suggestion. The herbed salt was indeed popular, and making it involved slightly different techniques that would add variety to their routine. Heinrich found himself looking forward to it as well, to the process of crushing dried herbs, blending them with salt in careful proportions, creating something that brought additional flavor and pleasure to people's meals. As the afternoon progressed toward evening, Heinrich sent Martin to begin closing up the salt works, while he visited the preservation shed one final time. Several items were ready for collection. Johann's dried fish had reached perfect completion, and the pork Anna had brought had finished its cure. He made notes about sending word to both so they could retrieve their preserved provisions. Standing in the shed doorway, watching the late afternoon light paint the mountains in shades of amber and rose, Heinrich felt that deep contentment settling over him once more. These moments of pause, of simple observation between tasks, had become increasingly precious to him as he aged. Not that 41 years old was ancient. He likely had many productive years remaining, but he had reached the age where he understood that time was not infinite, that each day carried its own particular value. The evening routine unfolded with its familiar sequence. Martin departed for home. Heinrich completed his rounds, banking fires and securing the salt works against the night. The walk back to his cottage took him through lengthening shadows, past windows beginning to glow with lamplight, through air growing cooler as the sun approached the horizon. At home, he found his neighbor had left venison stew, a rich preparation with root vegetables and herbs that must have been simmering most of the day. The meat was tender enough to fall apart at the touch of his spoon, and the broth carried complex flavors that spoke of careful seasoning and patient cooking. Heinrich ate slowly, savoring each bite, grateful for this woman's consistent kindness in preparing his meals. After supper, he took one of Peter's salted loaves and broke off a piece, tasting it carefully. The salt had indeed distributed perfectly, creating a savory depth that enhanced rather than overwhelmed the bread's natural flavor. The exterior crystals added textural interest and occasional bursts of stronger salt taste. He made a mental note to tell Peter again how successful the technique had been. The evening passed quietly. Heinrich sat by his fire, reading briefly from his book of hours, but mostly just watching the flames, letting his mind rest in that peaceful emptiness that was itself a kind of meditation. The day had been productive, satisfying, filled with good work and small pleasures. Tomorrow would bring more of the same, and he looked forward to it without impatience or anxiety. When he finally prepared for sleep, the night outside was clear and cold. The earlier clouds completely departed. Through his window, he could see stars scattered across the darkness like salt crystals on dark cloth, and the thought made him smile at the comparison. Everything in life seemed to circle back to salt eventually, or perhaps his mind simply made those connections because salt was the center of his daily existence. Under his wool blanket, feeling the day's pleasant tiredness in his muscles, Heinrich closed his eyes and let sleep approach. It came readily, carrying him down into its peaceful depths where no thoughts disturbed the darkness. The following morning brought frost for the first time that season. Heinrich woke to see it coating everything outside his window, a delicate crystalline layer that transformed the familiar world into something magical and strange. The frost caught the early sunlight and sparkled with such intensity, it almost hurt to look at directly. He dressed warmly, adding an extra layer beneath his usual tunic, and made his way carefully along the frost-slicked walkways to the salt works. The cold air bit at his cheeks and nose, but felt invigorating rather than unpleasant. His breath formed visible clouds that dissipated slowly in the still morning air. Inside the spring house, the contrast between the cold outside and the relative warmth within felt more pronounced than usual. The brine pools steamed noticeably, their surface warmth meeting the cold air to create shifting veils of vapor. Heinrich moved through his morning rounds with extra attention, knowing that the sudden cold could affect various aspects of the salt works operation. Martin arrived with his cheeks reddened from the cold, stamping his feet to restore circulation. "Winter is announcing itself," he said, rubbing his hands together near one of the fires Heinrich had built higher than usual. "Indeed," Heinrich agreed. "But frost like this often means clear weather, and clear weather is excellent for our work. We should take advantage while it lasts." They prepared the herbed salt as Heinrich had proposed, starting by crushing dried rosemary and thyme in a stone mortar. The herbs released their aromatic oils as they were ground, filling the workspace with scents that spoke of summer gardens and careful preservation. Heinrich demonstrated the proper ratio, enough herbs to flavor the salt noticeably, but not so much that the mixture became more herb than salt. "The key is balance," he explained as Martin took his turn with the mortar. "Salt should remain the primary element, with herbs providing enhancement rather than domination. Think of it like a conversation where one voice leads but others add harmony." They blended the crushed herbs with fine salt, mixing thoroughly to ensure even distribution. The result was a pale green-flecked product that looked as appealing as it smelled. Heinrich portioned it into small cloth bags, each tied with twine, creating gift-sized amounts that people could use for special meals or give as presents during the coming winter festivals. The work proceeded pleasantly through the morning, the frost outside gradually melting as the sun climbed higher. By midday, water dripped from eaves and branches, creating a liquid music that provided counterpoint to the crackling fires and gentle simmer of the brine pans. The salt works felt like an island of productive warmth in the cold autumn world. After their midday meal, Anna the butcher's wife arrived to collect her preserved pork. She examined each piece with evident satisfaction, noting how well the cure had penetrated, how the meat had firmed without becoming tough, how the color had developed to that appealing deep rose that indicated successful preservation. "Your work is always reliable, Heinrich," she said as she carefully packed the meat into her cart. "My husband and I are grateful for your skill." "The salt does the work," Heinrich replied with characteristic modesty. "I simply facilitate what nature accomplishes." But they both knew this wasn't entirely true. Successful preservation required knowledge, attention, proper timing, and the subtle adjustments that came only with long experience. Heinrich's modesty was genuine but incomplete, a habitual deflection of praise that was itself part of his character. After Anna departed, Heinrich found himself with a rare stretch of unstructured time. The pans were progressing well under Martin's watchful attention. No immediate preservation work awaited, and the various maintenance tasks had all been completed recently. He decided to use the time for something he had been postponing: reorganizing the herb and spice storage, where he kept the additional ingredients used for special salt preparations. The storage occupied a small alcove in the preservation shed, shelves lined with clay pots and cloth bags containing various dried herbs, spices, and other additions. Over time, things had become somewhat disorganized, and Heinrich felt the mild dissatisfaction of disorder in a system that usually ran with precision. He removed everything from the shelves, spreading it across the cutting table. There were more supplies than he had remembered: multiple varieties of dried herbs from different harvests, peppercorns both black and white, juniper berries, bay leaves, mustard seeds, coriander, even a small amount of precious cinnamon that a traveling merchant had traded for salt 2 summers ago. He sorted methodically, grouping like items together, discarding anything that had lost its potency or developed an off smell. The cinnamon he set aside carefully. It was still fragrant and valuable, worthy of being saved for only the most special occasions. Most of the herbs were in good condition, properly dried and stored, ready for continued use. As he worked, Heinrich found himself thinking about the web of connections that brought these items to him: herbs from local gardens, spices from distant lands, each one representing someone's labor and care. The juniper berries came from the mountains above the town, gathered by children who sold them for small coins. The peppercorns had traveled from places he had only heard about in travelers' tales, carried across seas and along trade routes by merchants whose names he would never know. Everything connected to everything else, he reflected. His salt went out into the world, and these herbs and spices came back in exchange, and together they created products that sustained and pleased people through the turning seasons. It was a kind of circulation, like blood through a body or water through the mountains, each element playing its part in maintaining the whole. By the time he finished reorganizing the storage, the afternoon had advanced considerably. The shelves now displayed their contents in orderly rows, each pot and bag clearly visible and easily accessible. Heinrich felt the satisfaction of a task completed well, of order restored where mild chaos had begun to creep in. He returned to the evaporation house to find Martin had harvested another substantial batch of salt during his absence. The boy had worked steadily and well, and the baskets near the fire held evidence of his productivity. Heinrich praised him sincerely, noting how much Martin's skills had developed over the months of his apprenticeship. "You're learning to read the salt's readiness without needing to ask," Heinrich observed. "That instinct is what separates adequate work from excellent work. The salt tells you when it's ready, and you've learned to listen." Martin ducked his head slightly, pleased but modest about the compliment. The boy had that quality Heinrich valued. He took pride in work well done, without letting that pride become arrogance. Such balance was rare in the young, and Heinrich recognized it as the mark of someone who would likely become a fine craftsman in whatever trade he ultimately chose. They worked together through the remaining afternoon hours, preparing pans for the next day's production, organizing the newly harvested salt, performing the steady maintenance that kept everything functioning smoothly. The clear weather held, and through the windows Heinrich could see the mountains sharp against the blue sky, their peaks beginning to show more substantial snow coverage. "Winter will arrive in earnest soon," he said, more observation than prediction. "Another month, perhaps two, and we'll be in the heart of the cold season. Our work will slow then, but not stop entirely." Martin nodded, adding wood to one of the fires. "My father says this winter may be harder than the last. He's preparing extra barrels for storage, anticipating people will need to preserve more provisions." "Your father is a wise man," Heinrich replied. "We'll do our part to ensure salt is available when people need it." As evening approached, Heinrich sent Martin home as usual, then completed his own closing routine. The sun was setting earlier now, the days noticeably shorter than they had been even a week previous. The angle of light through the windows had changed, casting longer shadows, painting everything in those rich amber and rose tones that belonged particularly to autumn evenings. Walking home, Heinrich noticed how the frost from the morning had left its mark. Some of the more delicate plants in gardens had blackened slightly. Their growing season definitively ended. But the hardier vegetables remained green and healthy, the cabbages and kale that would provide fresh food well into winter. Nature sorted itself, he thought, the strong persisting while the delicate yielded to the changing season. At his cottage, he found his neighbor had left rabbit stew, the meat tender and flavorful in a broth enriched with turnips and wild mushrooms. He ate gratefully, reflecting on how fortunate he was to have someone who tended to his domestic needs with such consistent care and skill. Tomorrow he would bring her several of the small bags of herbed salt as thanks, a gift she would appreciate and use well. After supper, he sat by the fire with his book of hours, reading the prayers for Compline, the final prayers before sleep. The Latin words flowed through his mind, familiar and comforting, connecting him once again to that vast community of believers who spoke these same prayers at this same hour across the Christian world. The thought brought peace, a sense of being part of something larger and more enduring than his individual life. The fire burned down to coals, and Heinrich prepared for sleep with his customary methodical care. Under his blanket, He felt the day's pleasant weariness settling into his bones, that satisfying tiredness that came from useful labor and time well spent. His breathing slowed and deepened, and consciousness began its nightly retreat. Sleep arrived like the frost that had decorated the morning quietly, inevitably, transforming everything it touched into something peaceful and still. The next several days fell into a rhythm that felt both productive and contemplative. The clear weather held, bringing crisp mornings and bright afternoons perfect for salt production. Heinrich and Martin worked in comfortable partnership, their movements increasingly synchronized as Martin's skills continued developing. The evaporation pans produced salt in abundance, and the storage barrels began filling with the fruits of their labor. Johann the fisherman returned to collect his preserved trout, expressing deep satisfaction with how they had turned out. The fish had dried to exactly the right consistency, firm but not brittle, retaining enough oils to stay flavorful while being thoroughly preserved against spoilage. He pressed 2 of the finished trout into Heinrich's hands as additional thanks, refusing to accept payment for them. "You've preserved these fish," Johann said with simple logic. "The least I can do is provide you with some to eat." Heinrich accepted graciously, knowing that refusing would insult the fisherman's generosity. That evening he cooked one of the trout over his fire, and the flesh flaked perfectly, seasoned by the salt cure and carrying the clean taste of cold mountain streams. It was perhaps the finest fish he had eaten in months. Marguerite came for her preserved chickens, her weathered face showing relief and gratitude at having this provision secured for winter. She was a widow with limited means, and these chickens represented significant resources carefully husbanded. Heinrich took extra time explaining how best to store and use them, wanting to ensure she received maximum benefit from her investment. "You're very kind, Heinrich," she said as she prepared to leave. "Not all craftsmen take such care with those of us who have little coin to spare." "Good preservation serves everyone equally," Heinrich replied. "Salt doesn't distinguish between rich and poor. It does its work the same regardless of who benefits." After she departed, Heinrich stood for a moment thinking about his own words. There was something profound in that simple truth: salt treated all equally, performing its ancient function without judgment or favor. Perhaps that was part of why he found the work so satisfying. It was honest in a way that cut through all social pretension and hierarchy. Salt was salt, and it served whoever needed it with the same patient reliability. The days continued their progression, each one slightly shorter than the last, the angle of sunlight shifting daily as autumn moved deeper toward winter. Heinrich noticed these changes with the attention of someone whose work was intimately connected to seasons and weather. The morning frosts became more common, lasting later into the day. The mountains accumulated more snow, the white line creeping lower down their slopes with each passing week. One afternoon, a traveling merchant arrived at the salt works, his wagon loaded with goods for trade. His name was Robert, and Heinrich had dealt with him for several years. The merchant was 45 years old, his weathered face showing the effects of years spent traveling in all weather, his manner both practical and personable. "Heinrich," Robert greeted him warmly, "I'm preparing for winter runs and need to stock up on salt. What quantities can you provide?" They walked together through the storage room, discussing what Heinrich had available and what Robert needed. The merchant wanted both table salt and preservation salt, along with several bags of the herbed salt for sale in the larger towns he would visit. They negotiated quantities and prices, the conversation easy between two men who had developed mutual trust through repeated fair dealings. "The roads will close soon," Robert said as they finalized the transaction. "This may be my last trip until spring. I'll take as much as I can carry." Heinrich helped him load the barrels and bags onto his wagon, careful to distribute the weight evenly for the horses' sake. Robert paid in a mixture of coin and trade good some fine wool cloth that would make a warm winter cloak, a small knife with an excellent blade, and several pounds of excellent wax candles that burned cleaner and brighter than the tallow candles Heinrich usually used. "Fair trade," Heinrich said, satisfied with the exchange. "Travel safely, Robert. May the weather hold for your journey." The merchant departed with a wave, his wagon creaking under its load, his horse stepping carefully on the uneven ground. Heinrich watched him disappear down the road toward town, carrying salt that would travel to places Heinrich himself would never see, serving purposes he would never know. The thought pleased rather than troubled him, his work rippling outward through the world, touching lives in ways both large and small. That evening, Heinrich used one of the new candles Robert had provided. The light it cast was noticeably better than his usual illumination, steady and bright without the smoke and smell of burning fat. He read from his book of hours with greater ease, the improved light making the Latin text clearer. It was a small luxury, but one that added considerably to the evening's comfort. The following day brought clouds again, though not the heavy rain-bearing type from the previous week. These were higher, thinner clouds that diffused the sunlight without blocking it entirely, creating a softer quality to the day's illumination. Heinrich found the lighting pleasant, gentler on the eyes than full sun, yet bright enough for all necessary work. Martin arrived with news that his father had completed more barrels and wondered if Heinrich might need additional storage capacity before winter fully arrived. They discussed it over their morning bread, and Heinrich decided that yes, a few more barrels would be prudent. The autumn production had been particularly good, and having adequate storage meant he could maintain supplies through winter without worry. "Tell your father I'll visit his workshop tomorrow," Heinrich said. "We can discuss sizes and timing then." The day unfolded with its now familiar rhythm, tending fires, monitoring pans, harvesting salt, performing the countless small tasks that composed their work. Heinrich found himself thinking about how these rhythms had become as natural to him as breathing, how the salt works had shaped his life into patterns that brought both purpose and peace. In the afternoon, he worked on preparing a special batch of salt infused with dried lavender, a variety that some people use not for cooking, but for making sachets to scent linens and clothing. The process required careful grinding of the dried lavender flowers, then mixing them with salt in precise proportions. The resulting product was both beautiful pale purple flecks against white crystals and fragrant, filling the workspace with a clean, calming scent. Martin watched the process with interest, asking questions about technique and proportion. Heinrich explained patiently, pleased by the boy's genuine curiosity. Teaching was itself a kind of preservation. He reflected passing knowledge from one generation to the next, ensuring that skills and understanding would continue beyond any individual life. As the afternoon light began its transition toward evening, Heinrich sent Martin home and completed his own closing tasks. The salt works had become so familiar that he could navigate it in near darkness, his hands knowing where every tool hung, his feet knowing every irregularity in the floor. This intimate knowledge brought its own satisfaction, the sense of belonging that came from long association with a place. Walking home through the gathering dusk, Heinrich noticed the first star appearing in the eastern sky, bright against the deepening blue. The temperature was dropping quickly, and he pulled his cloak more tightly around his shoulders. Smoke rose from chimneys throughout the town, carrying the scent of cooking fires and evening meals. Somewhere a dog barked, and a child's laughter drifted from an open doorway before being cut off as the door closed against the cold. At his cottage, he built up his fire and ate the meal his neighbor had left, a thick pottage of beans and barley with chunks of salt pork that added richness and flavor. The food warmed him from the inside, and he ate slowly, savoring each spoonful, grateful for this simple sustenance. After eating, he found himself too restless to simply sit by the fire. Instead, he took up the small knife Robert had traded him and examined it more carefully in the candlelight. The blade was beautifully made, sharp and well balanced, with a handle of smooth horn that fit his hand perfectly. It was better than any knife he currently owned, and he appreciated both its quality and the thoughtfulness of Robert's selection. He used the knife to sharpen his quill pens, a task that had been needing attention for some time. The blade cut through the quills cleanly, creating perfect points for writing. When he finished, he had half a dozen newly sharpened pens lined up on his table, ready for whatever record-keeping or correspondence might require them. With the small task completed, Heinrich prepared for sleep with his usual methodical care. Under his blanket, listening to the fire settle on the hearth, he felt that deep contentment washing over him once more. His days were full of good work, useful labor that served his community. His nights brought rest and peace. What more could any person reasonably want? Sleep arrived like a trusted companion, familiar and welcome, carrying him down into its peaceful depths where no thoughts disturbed the darkness.